All right. As everyone kind of trickles in, I'm very excited to host our first Ptarmigan series of the 2025 year. So for those of you who've been with us, welcome back. For those of you who this might be kind of the first time that you're joining us, welcome. And again, for those newcomers, also feel free to check out our website, ptarmigan.stanford.edu. We have a number of other speakers that we've hosted in the past. All of these lectures have been recorded and they've been organized on the website. So please feel free to check them out there. But today we're really excited to welcome Professor Sarah Emanuel. Professor Emanuel is an assistant professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University. Her work is broadly construed with biblical studies, working on first century Judaism and early Christianity. And today she will be presenting the many personalities of the Apostle Paul. So without further ado, Professor, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. There we go. So good evening. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to Stanford University's Religious Studies Department and to Michael Penn and Anuj Amin for organizing this series and for inviting me to speak with you all this evening. So as Anuj shared, I am a scholar of biblical studies. My training, broadly speaking, is in the ways ancient Jewish and early Christ-centered sources have functioned since their inception, from their ancient contexts of production up through their contemporary contexts of reception. To that end, I implement both traditional historical critical methodologies and contemporary critical approaches to the ancient materials. Much of my work is legible through the lens of literary and cultural studies. I'm interested in how the Bible, a collection of literary and cultural artifacts, creates, reflects, responds to, and is consumed by communities of storytellers and story listeners, and how interpreters might utilize a variety of theories and methods to explore its layered modes of meaning making. The artifacts explored today are those of Paul's letters, specifically those related to Paul's ideas of salvation, both in their contexts of production and in their contexts of scholarly reception. To offer an outline, part one of this talk will introduce Paul and his letters in their ancient context. Listeners will learn that there is much to be said for Paul's differing ideas from letter to letter, so much so that it seems as if Paul may be purposefully highlighting different theologies and perhaps even different parts of his personality to different audiences. While I will introduce these differences, this talk's title alludes less to Paul's own change of mind from letter to letter and more to the different theories and theologies scholars have placed onto Paul in their own contexts of scholarly reception. Part two of this talk will thus introduce these later contexts, and in doing so, will unpack the three main schools of thought that have emerged in scholarly receptions of Paul's theology of salvation: the old perspective on Paul, the new perspective on Paul, and the radical new perspective on Paul, which is now more frequently called the Paul within Judaism approach. So part one, the New Testament's Paul in ancient context. The New Testament is the second component of the Christian Bible, following what Christians call the Old Testament. There are 27 books within the New Testament, which collectively discuss the life of Jesus and how early followers thought it best to be in relation to him. These books were written by different people across the first and into the early second century of the Common Era. As such, there is no singular understanding of Jesus within the New Testament, but rather a multitude of ideas. With some possible exceptions, the New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek, which was the common language of the author's social locations. Of the New Testament's 27 books, 13 are attributed to an apostolos, which means herald or messenger in Greek, named Paul. That's nearly half the New Testament, making Paul, for many, the second most important person in the Christian tradition, just behind Jesus. Pauline theology, crafted through interpretations of Paul's writings, has indeed had profound impact on the development of Christian thought and practice and remains central to the Christian church. This includes Paul's theology of eschatological salvation, meaning it includes his understanding of who will be saved in the end of days and how they will be saved. Despite Paul's hold on the New Testament, it is difficult to know who Paul was, at least from a historical perspective. Much to scholarly chagrin, Paul never wrote a systematic autobiography, that is, a clear description of his life, ministry, and theology in one place. Instead, for over a decade, he wrote to different communities across the ancient Mediterranean, texts that change in tone, motive, and perspective depending upon when and to whom he wrote. It is important to remember that, as alluded to above, these texts are letters, letters that were written to different people with different questions and different needs. It is also unclear how many of the 13 letters Paul actually authored. Based on historical and textual study, most scholars agree that only 7, although maybe a few more, of the 13 were written by the historical Paul. In other words, it is likely that some of the 13 were not written by Paul, but instead by those who wanted to write in Paul's name, which was a common practice in the ancient world. Quite remarkable it is, then, that Paul's theology impacted so greatly the trajectory of Christian history. The historical Paul may not have written much, but what he did write changed the world. Still, it is difficult to decipher what exactly Paul thought of Jesus and how best to follow him in the end times. Even when examining Paul's undisputed letters, those agreed upon 7 highlighted in red, readers notice discrepancies. Again, Paul was not always consistent. He changed tone, motive, rhetoric, and perspective depending upon when and to whom he was writing. But even a singular undisputed Pauline text can be difficult to decipher. Paul's writings contain so many internal tangents, ambiguities, and intertextual diatribes that searching for meaning can feel daunting. Such confusions, whether across undisputed letters or within a singular text, can certainly be a Paul thing. He is unclear. But it can also speak to the effects of literary scribes and copyists, often enslaved workers who transcribed someone's oral dictations and or created written copies of previously written works. Romans 16:22, for example, names a scribe called Tertius, literally third, which suggests either that Paul relied on an enslaved literary worker to craft his original letter, or that a copyist inserted his name into a later edition. Either way, it is evident that Paul was not the only person crafting his letters. Just as a scribe could have changed what Paul dictated, a copyist could have altered his original words, purposefully or by accident. This brings us back to the issue of not knowing for sure what the historical Paul actually wrote or said, an issue I admit I bear far less frustration toward when taking into account the possibility that enslaved scribes changed Paul's writings as a form of rebellion or subversion to the deplorable institution that was the Roman slave market. Suffice it to say, the author of 2 Peter in the New Testament was correct when he said that, quote, Paul's letters contain some things that are hard to understand. You are forewarned, end quote. Some scholars even confess that we cannot do historical Paul studies. The information about him is too complicated and too scarce. Indeed, conducting research on Paul is, in many respects, akin to playing a game of detective. Readers are forced to consider all evidence when deciphering his ideas. When is Paul writing? To whom is Paul writing? To what might Paul be responding? Did Paul write the letters himself, or did a scribe write or later edit for him? How many sentences do we even know reflect Paul's own thinking? Scholars often do not know the answers to these questions, at least not fully. None of this is to suggest that attempts to construct a historical Paul, who he was, where he came from, what he believed, never occur. They do. Despite the difficulties, many scholars still try to piece together information from Paul's undisputed letters so as to arrive at some sort of picture, even if faint, of the apostle's life and mindset. Such a picture typically looks like this. Paul, maybe also Saul, was a literate Greek-speaking Jew of the 1st century CE. He lived under the auspices of the Roman Empire, a Hellenized imperial system that honored the divinity of any number of gods and goddesses, including emperors, mostly posthumously. Paul's God, however, was the God of Israel, who was sometimes referred to as Yahweh by ancient Israelites, or in modern Jewish parlance, Adonai or Hashem, or closer to Paul's own day, simply God, Theos in Greek, or Lord or Master, Kurios in Greek. Paul was also a follower of Jesus as his Christ, which means that he thought a Jewish man named Jesus was his Messiah, his Moshiach or king, the one whom he believed would overthrow the powers that be, including Rome, and usher in a new world order in which his God, the God of Israel, would reign supreme. For the duration of Paul's life, the Roman Empire did not adhere to such Christ confessing ideologies and often marginalized those who did. Despite such power imbalances, however, Paul still promoted his beliefs, including especially to non Jews, which Paul referred to as Gentiles. But Paul also, like most Jews of the first century, Christ confessing or not, interacted with the broader Greco Roman culture. Paul read in Greek, spoke in Greek, and crafted his ideas of salvation alongside Jewish and Greco Roman philosophies. While this information may seem wanting, and I'm not saying it isn't, it is more than we can say about most people in the first century. Some might argue it is even more than we can say about Jesus. This is because the sources that say the most about Jesus are the canonical Gospels, texts that were written decade after Jesus' lifetime and in a language Jesus likely did not speak. Jesus, put simply, did not write for himself. Paul did. Still, it remains important to remember that there existed no printing presses or recording devices in antiquity, making any source we have about someone's life, even if written or stated autobiographically, questionable. Changes to lives were made through both the oral storytelling process and the written copying one. Furthermore, the majority of the population was illiterate. Most lives were never documented. The fact of the matter remains that we have little to no access to most people from the first century. Taking all of this into account, it becomes easy to see how the just shared summary of Paul's life is nothing short of remarkable. Of course, there remain aspects of Paul's life that are contested, including how he felt about Jesus and how best to follow him. This includes Paul's theology of eschatological salvation, again, his understanding of who will be saved in the end of days and how they will be saved. It is even debated whether Paul thought about salvation and the end times in a systematic way at all. In other words, because Paul did not write a systematic autobiography, it is difficult to know whether he inserted into each source a unified theological premise, i.e., a systematic theology, or whether he simply wrote to different people about different things depending upon the context. We don't even know if Paul imagined his letters being read together at all. I suspect he didn't. So, for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to introduce the three most common and most contested schools of thought regarding Paul's ideas of salvation, which include especially ideas of who Paul thinks will be saved and why. Again, these schools are called the old perspective on Paul, the new perspective on Paul, and the radical new perspective on Paul, which many scholars now refer to as the Paul within Judaism approach. As you can see from the reframing or renaming of the third school, much of the conversation around Paul's ideas of salvation center around Paul's ideas of Jews. While it is shared across schools that Gentiles who believe in Jesus as the Christ are included for Paul, debates revolve around Paul's inclusion of Jews. A major question scholars have asked for centuries is, are Jews included in Paul's salvific plan? There's a nuance to this that should not be overlooked. The way in which scholars have answered such question has been influenced by how Jews have been treated in interpreters' own social contexts. In other words, what follows is indeed a summary of the differing theologies, dare I say personalities, scholars have given to Paul. And while it is possible some of these ideas mirror those of the historical Pauls, none of what follows reflects necessarily how Paul viewed himself. I will begin with some shared starting points across the schools and will then move toward their differences, including the different social contexts from which each school has emerged. Part 2, Receptions. When it comes to deciphering Paul's theology of the end times, Paul's letter to a Christ-following community in Rome, dated to the late 50s of the Common Era, stands out. This is true for all three schools of thought. For unlike Paul's other letters, Romans was neither written to a community Paul helped organize, nor was it composed as a response to the specific needs and questions of others, as far as we know. Instead, it seems to have been crafted as an introduction to a prominent Christ-following assembly in Rome, one Paul had never met. While the letter is filled with its own theological complexities and obscurities, its premise as an overview of Paul's thought makes it unique. The general idea is that if Paul was providing some kind of summary of his views, as opposed to specific answers to specific questions, then maybe this can unlock more clearly some of Paul's more sustained ideological principles. It is also in Paul's letter to the Romans that he explains what he calls the mystery, to mysterion in Greek, of his God's plans for human salvation. In chapters 9 through 11, he argues that aside from sparing a remnant of Israel, i.e., a small group of Jews, God has disabled Israel from recognizing Jesus as the Messiah or Christ, Christos being the Greek for Messiah. As a result, many Jews have been excluded from God's salvific plan. The reason for this, Paul says, is for the sake of Gentiles. Quote, through Israel's stumbling, salvation has come to Gentiles, end quote. Paul adds, however, that those from Israel who change their minds and come to see that Jesus is indeed the Christ may be grafted back into God's saving grace. Using an olive tree as a metaphor for the new world order, including who is saved and how, Paul says that Jewish and Gentile believers in Christ represent the tree's lasting branches, or the eschatological nation's lasting branches. A remnant of believing Jewish branches have stayed, while unbelieving Jewish branches have fallen or been cut off. Believing Gentile branches have been grafted in, and Jewish branches can be grafted back in through stopping their unbelief. Paul then concludes with a summary and an added note. Quote, I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. This is the summary. And so all Israel will be saved. This is the addition. Quote. Chapters 9 through 11 are often described as the climax of the letter, at least by those attempting to make sense of Paul's overarching ideas of end-time salvation. Because Paul spends so much time in his other letters discussing Gentile Christ-confessing thought and practice, the fact that he in Romans 9 through 11 is also discussing Jews makes these chapters at the very least intriguing. What Paul means in these chapters, however, remains, to borrow from Romans, a mystery. On the one hand, it is clear that Gentiles must believe in Jesus as the Christ in order to obtain eschatological salvation, or end-time salvation. Surrounding verses paired with Paul's other undisputed letters reveal that Gentiles must come into the Christ-following faith for such deliverance. The placement of Jews, on the other hand, remains hotly debated. If, for example, all Israel will be saved, does that mean all Jews will be saved? If so, how? Why? When? Who or what is Israel at this point in the explication? Until recently, most answers have fallen prey to Christian supersessionism, the idea that the Gentile church is the new, true Israel, and that only Gentiles in Christ will be saved. Jews, in other words, can only be saved in the end of days as Israel if they rid themselves of their Jewishness and honor Christ like Gentiles. This gets us to the first school of thought, the old perspective on Paul. Until the late 20th century, scholars often adhered to the Christian interpretation that Paul fundamentally rejected Judaism, and that the goodness of his message was its non-Jewish sentiment, including the refusal of end times admission to any and all Jews. In short, Paul may have been born a Jew, but once he turned to Christ, he appropriately left it. The story supporting this interpretation goes something like this. In the mid-1st century CE, there lived a Jewish man named Saul who antagonized followers of Christ. On his way to a synagogue in Damascus, however, he had a vision of Jesus as a resurrected Messiah. Through this experience, Saul realized that Christ followers were right. Jesus was indeed the Messiah. He also realized that Jewishness was marked by unattainable law codes. Humans needed grace through Jesus, not law, in order to attain salvation. Saul thus converted to Christianity and deemed Jewishness, most especially its halakhic, i.e. lawful or ethnic traditions, late, as in dead. He also changed his name from the Jewish Saul to the Roman Paul to signify his new convictions. In sum, Judaism, through Jesus, and later supported by Saul/Paul, became a sterile and overbearing tradition of works, while Christianity became the grace-filled tradition of love. Jews who did not rid themselves of their ethnic ties to Judaism and convert to a non-ethnocentric Christianity would be left out of this love and in turn be left out of the end of days. This, in a nutshell, is the old perspective on Paul. The old perspective is a modern scholarly construct, yet one that has roots in ancient conceptions of Jews and Judaism. Already in the early century CE, not long after the life and death of Jesus, Gentile leaders from a variety of Christ-following perspectives disparaged Jewish ideology as heresy in order to strengthen their self-acclaimed un-Jewish orthodoxy, so declared Jews other and un-Jewishness self. This ideological sparring quickly attached onto perceptions of Jewish behavior, blood, and body. For many, Jews thought badly, thus Jews behaved badly, thus their body and blood were spoiled. We see evidence of this kind of thinking across early Christ-centered texts and contexts. Here are just a few examples. In the second to third century, the Gentile North African church father Tertullian wrote that Jews are, quote, always stained, forever red with the blood of the prophets and of the Lord himself, and are conscious of this hereditary stain of their fathers, end quote. In the 4th century, the Gentile church father Jerome asserted that anyone who followed Jewish rituals was, quote, doomed to the abyss of the devil, end quote, while his contemporary Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, wrote that Jews are, quote, possessed by the unclean spirit of demons. When solidifying the Nicene Creed in the same century, the Emperor Constantine affirmed that Jews are, quote, a people who, having stained their hands in a most heinous outrage, which he thinks is Jews killing Jesus, an ahistorical claim, have thus polluted their souls and are deservedly blind. Therefore, Gentile Christ followers have nothing in common with that most hostile of people, the Jews, end quote. Shortly after the establishment of Nicene Christianity, which is to say Gentile Christianity, as the imperial religion, Archbishop of Constantinople John Chrysostom preached that Jews are not human, but rather beasts and demons. Of their bestial condition, he wrote that their condition is no better than that of pigs or goats. Of their demonic state, he said that Jews, quote, themselves are demons who danced with the devil. Chrysostom asserted that evil is so imprinted upon the Jewish body that Jews are carriers of absolute disgust, and in turn, they are fit for slaughter. Indeed, it is precisely when one comes across emphatic animalizing and demonizing language directed at Jews that the line between theological anti-Judaism and pre-modern racial anti-Semitism becomes blurriest. The implicit postulating of an ontological difference between Jews and Christians pushes it from one kind of anti-Jewish hatred to another. Such opposition, or more rightly, such anti-Jewish racism, may have been integral to the survival of any kind of a Gentile Christ-following norm. As historian Robert Michael attests, Gentile Christ followers needed Jews and Judaism as a kind of antitype to define nearly everything they were and stood for. After all, Jesus was Jewish. A clear way to prove that conversion to Judaism was unnecessary was to discount that tradition altogether. Thus, the way Jews followed God had to be wrong. The way Jews read their scriptures had to be outdated. The way Jews performed their ideology upon and through the body, such as through circumcision and diet, had to be demonic. While Jesus, like Paul, may have been born a Jew, early leaders in favor of a Gentile assembly for Christ needed to assert that Jesus' God-given mission was to establish something different, something better. This survival strategy shaped Christianity's attitude toward Jews for centuries. From the 4th century onward, the papacy declared Jews a collective public opponent, diseased killers of Christ who deserved divine damnation, which extended into how Jews were treated by Christian governments. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church passed laws limiting Jewish employment, travel, marriage, dress, housing, and interpersonal relations with Catholics. In the 13th century, Jews were even required to wear distinguishable clothing, such as a yellow badge or pointed hat, and they were also by then accustomed to being relegated to the ghettos. Even when laws were set to protect Jews, they were rendered dangerous, and the laws were not always followed. By the 15th century, Jews were long called the collective enemy of Christendom, blamed even for killing Christian children and baking them into their Passover matzah. Martin Luther, a German theologian who challenged the Catholic Church by way of what is now called the Protestant Reformation, was born in this era and inherited Christianity's supersessionist and anti-Jewish ideologies. One of his foundational beliefs was that humans are destined to fail. As such, he maintained that the Jewish law was useful insofar as it showcased the wretchedness of humanity. Nobody can successfully follow all laws or do so in a way that does not promote self-satisfaction, according to Luther. Luther also favored, from his perspective, the un-Jewish Paul. He privileged especially Romans 1:17, which states, "For the righteousness of God is revealed in it from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous one shall live out of faith." From this verse, Luther argued that human effort is fruitless in the quest to please God. Anyone who suggested otherwise was missing the point and, moreover, was showcasing their ineptitude and self-righteousness. The problem of his time, then, was that rather than stray from a works righteous model, the Catholic Church had leaned into it by promoting the idea that Christians could buy forgiveness through deeds, confessions, and indulgences. In the face of this contemporaneous Catholic standard, Luther declared a different set of Christian truths: Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone. What he meant by these truths is that Scripture shows that forgiveness of sins occurs solely through God's grace, which is available only to those who have faith in Christ. Salvation, in other words, never comes through works, but instead only through grace. This theology is often referred to as a justification by faith model, meaning that a person is made right with God, i.e., justified, by believing in the grace of God through Christ, as opposed to following Catholic deeds, or worse, Jewish law. The traditional Catholic Church, in short, was too Jewish for Luther. It focused too much on a material and transactional relationship with the divine, which he believed led to self-satisfaction and, in turn, damnation. It was thus from Luther's non-Jewish doctrine of justification by faith, a doctrine proclaimed through his readings of Paul's dichotomy of grace and works, that the Protestant Reformation was formed. Luther's work was so influential that many scholars refer to his understanding of Paul as reflective of a modern Christian majority, including from within the biblical field. Contrary to popular assumption, biblical studies was not founded upon a professional versus confessional dichotomy, but instead a predominantly German Protestant ideology hailed as scientific reason. Until the end of the 20th century, even the most reputable scholars rendered anti-Judaism the rightful way of Paul, and thus the rightful way of the world. New Testament texts and good interpreters of them showcased the truth that is Jewish inferiority. Jews were a tormented, particularistic people, unable to see the truth that lies in their own texts or their own God. Jesus and his greatest apostle Paul are for the Gentiles. They are the ones who, to use Paul's own language, have ears that hear and eyes that see. In sum, while tides were shifting throughout modern biblical scholarship, historical critical New Testament studies until the late 20th century typically relied on Protestant invested thinkers to imagine Christian origins. These, of course, were not the only thinkers shaping the field, neither, of course, was Luther, but their ideas helped instill within the discipline an anti-Jewish Pauline consensus, one that is now called the old perspective on Paul. Again, this perspective is as follows. Paul, in realizing that Jesus was God's chosen, grace-giving Christ, rejected the non-grace focused but rather legalistic Judaism. He converted to Christianity, changed his name to the Greek-sounding Paul, and spread the good news of a Gentile, faith-based Christian tradition. As such, Judaism became late Judaism, dead and sterile. For biblical scholars invested in faith, and many were, this good history showed that to be a good Christian meant to believe that Jewishness cannot save, and perhaps more insidious, that Jews cannot be saved. This, for them, was the essence of Paul's theology, and thus the essence of salvation. The old perspective has contributed to the hatred, repudiation, and even killing of Jews. Stories, put simply, shape ideologies, and the old perspective's narrativizing of Jews as targets of divine wrath has convinced many that the othering of Jews in the name of Christianity is appropriate. The Holocaust is perhaps the most extreme example of this, and that much of Hitler's anti-Jewish successes can be attributed to the prevalence of anti-Jewish Christian theology. This is not to say that Nazi ideology was represented as a Christian ideology. It was not. But rather that Nazi propagandists could rely on Christian rhetoric to bolster their anti-Jewish claims and persuade Christians to support their politics. Some Nazi sympathizers even utilized Nazi race science to prove that Jesus, i.e., Paul's Messiah, was not Jewish, but in fact an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic Aryan. This was persuasive for some Christians, so much so that Lutheran pastor Siegfried Loeffler wrote that Jesus was, quote, the most positive anti-Semite of all time, end quote. Thankfully, the goodness of an anti-Jewish Paul and Jesus has not won the day, at least not in the biblical field. Unfortunately, it does continue to win the day for some. Here is an image from October 2022 over the Los Angeles 405. John 8:44 is quoted with Revelation 3:9, a verse that is widely misunderstood, but does have synagogue and Satan in the same sentence. So it is used to make the connection between synagogues or Jews and Satan. But while there were thinkers who interrogated Christian anti-Judaism prior to the Second World War, for New Testament scholarship, the Holocaust was the breaking point. With 2/3 of the worldly Jewish population dead, New Testament interpreters finally felt called to reevaluate the canon's place in anti-Jewish history. But rather than disagreeing with Paul, which is to say, disagreeing with Paul's own ethics, the move was to change the field's understanding of who Paul was and what Paul meant. I must add, however, that there was a remarkable archaeological discovery that supported this shift to read Paul differently. From 1946 to 1956, a number of ancient sources, some known and many previously unknown, were found in caves on the northern shore of the Dead Sea at a site called Qumran. Among other things, the text showcased the extent to which Jews in the late centuries BCE and into the first century CE not only thought apocalyptically, eschatologically, and soteriologically, which is to say, they thought about good and evil and how such forces would be overcome by God and God's helpers, including a Messiah in the end of days. We see this, for example, in the Messianic apocalypse from Cave 4, but also that Jews argued with each other about how best to make sense of such ideas. The Halakhic letter from Qumran is often cited in this regard. Thus, while the theologies of the New Testament, ones of a Messiah who would overthrow evil and inaugurate a new world order, may appear different from some of the ideas we see in the Hebrew Bible, otherwise known as the Christian Old Testament. And while the animosity between Jesus or Paul and Jews within the New Testament may seem anti-Jewish to modern readers, it all started to look very Jewish in relation to these newly discovered Jewish sources. In doing reevaluative work on the heels of the Shoah and the discovery at Qumran, many biblical scholars started to argue that rather than dismantling Jewish ideologies, the New Testament reflected a Jewishness of its time. They asserted that the New Testament is at its core a remarkably Jewish text, filled with Jewish characters imagined by Jewish authors. Jesus, aka Joshua, if we transliterate the Aramaic to English, was not Aryan, but in fact a Jewish teacher from the Jewish region of Galilee who was motivated to share his interpretations of Jewish theology with fellow Jews. To believe that Jesus was the Christ meant to believe that he was the Jewish Messiah, the one who would usher in the Jewish eschatological hope of a better future, a future in which humans regained their immortality, and in which all nations would see the God of Israel as the one true God. Even if Jesus gained Gentile followers, these Gentiles were still entering a fundamentally Jewish conversation. And even if Jews debated with Jesus about theology, such did not separate Jesus's theologies from an overarching Jewish worldview. Paul, a self-described Jew, was also entering Jewish conversations. Although he was writing letters to a predominantly Gentile Christ-following audience, he still, in doing so, quoted the Torah and the prophets, engaged matters of Jewish faith and practice, observed the Jewish commandments, believed in the God of Israel, and prayed for the coming of a Jewish Messiah. Paul's eventual belief in Jesus as the Christ did not diminish Paul's Jewishness, but rather added to it. While various partings between what we now call Judaism and Christianity did occur throughout the later century CE, due in large part to the aforementioned use of pre-modern anti-Jewish racism to maintain Gentile Christ-following survival, Christ-centered theologies in the earliest centuries, and certainly during the years of Paul's writings in the mid-first century, were not antithetical to Jewish thought. A couple decades later, after the discovery at Qumran, the field was given another push, this time by the late E.P. Sanders' 1977 monograph, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. Here, Sanders argued that Israel's narrativized relationship with God was in fact always about grace, not law. Combing through a number of ancient Jewish texts, canonical and non-canonical, Sanders came to the conclusion that, through God's love, God bestowed a covenant to Abraham, and in turn, Abraham's descendants, the people of Israel. Then, through Israel's returned faith in God, Israel gets to participate in God-gifted works or laws. To put it otherwise, God's promise to be Israel's God is made with grace, and the giving of codes is God's gift. And while observing God's laws adds depth, privilege, and import to the relationship between God and Israel, Israel is still granted a relationship with God even when Israel falls short. The laws are extra, they are often broken, and there are always ways to continually establish and reestablish connection. God, through it all, remains. This wasn't just rendered good history or good literary analysis, but also good ethics. Again, after World War II, it became increasingly clear among Christian thinkers that traditional supersessionist views of Jews and Judaism, views that included the widespread belief that Jews were ethnocentric supremacists wrongfully obsessed with flesh and law, played a role in the centuries-long persecution of Jews and could no longer be tolerated. Sanders' argument, alongside the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, made a new reading of Paul possible. In fact, almost any post-Sanders evaluation of Paul begins with acknowledging the change the Holocaust necessitated, and then builds upon Sanders' thesis with the help of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here are some examples of a post-Holocaust starting point, all from renowned biblical scholars, and I'll quote aloud just a few. And the word of Magna Zetterholm, quote, "I'm quite aware that recognizing the connection between the traditional Christian teaching on Paul and the crimes committed against the Jewish people throughout history has led me to take a new approach," end quote. Or Matthew Thiessen, who contends that, quote, "where uncertainty in Paul's letters persists, we have a moral obligation to choose against readings that harm others," end quote. With Christian supersessionism and the Holocaust in mind, he reads Paul in a way that, quote, "is not dependent on the denigration of ancient Jews and Judaism," end quote. A key factor in the pursuit to no longer see Paul as denigrating Jews and Judaism is to consider more fully the context within which Paul found himself. So this is where insights from the Dead Sea Scrolls and Sanders' evaluation of Jewish law come in. Coining the term new perspective to refer to a new orientation toward Paul and Jews, New Testament scholars N.T. Wright and the now late James Dunn arrived at the following thesis. Because Israel's theology was always about grace, Paul could not be countering Israel or Judaism via a works versus grace framework. They also suggested that faith in Jesus, a Jew, was part of a Jewish orientation and therefore part of Judaism. To receive everlasting grace through faith in and of Jesus served as a continuation of grace received in and of Abraham. Dunn and Wright did, however, take issue with issues of what they thought was Jewish ethnocentrism. On their reading, Jews of the first century continued to celebrate an exceptional and ethnically bound relationship with God, which made them fail to grasp the universality of God's grace. According to them, Paul urged Jews to see that their God was not ethnocentric, that their God was not particular to or special for Jews, and to realize that God's grace was for everyone. Grace, not race, was Wright's overall synopsis. Paul's universalist theology, these scholars made clear, is what made Paul good. From this vantage point, the traditional new perspective does position Paul within a Jewish context, but it also reads Paul as not just a good Jew, but the good Jew, second perhaps to only Jesus, whereas other Jews, most Jews, remain less than. This also ties to Dunn's and Wright's own social locations in the UK upon crafting their new perspective work. Whereas biblical scholars prior to the war maintained an intellectual center in Germany, such center moved toward the United States and the United Kingdom in the years after. These two centers responded to the Holocaust in slightly different ways, which can provide potential insight into both the new perspective and later pushback. So I'll start with the United States and then work back to the UK and the new perspective. On the American front, radical shifts occurred in public consciousness in the 1960s and 1970s. Scholars suggest that one reason for this transformation was the 1961 global broadcast of the Adolf Eichmann trial, during which, unlike the trials at Nuremberg decades prior, a number of personal testimonies by Holocaust survivors were heard. As Jewish studies scholar Alan Mintz puts it, the intense public nature of the trial not only communicated an enormous amount of information, it also transformed the status of the Holocaust in the American mind. It became, in a sense, registered in American collective memory as a key event in the modern age and as a watershed in the definition of what humanity is capable of. Other watershed moments included viewings of the Diary of Anne Frank in film and on stage, and the 1978 television miniseries Holocaust, and perhaps most especially, President Jimmy Carter's very public move to make Holocaust memory part of American memory. In 1978, Carter established a President's Commission on the Holocaust, with Shoah survivor Elie Wiesel as chair. In 1979, the commission presented to Carter its report, which included the recommendation of a Holocaust memorial on American soil. In 1980, the United States Congress approved the memorial's construction by a unanimous vote. Many scholars attest, in fact, that nowhere was the shift in American consciousness on the Holocaust seen more dramatically than the construction of the Holocaust Museum on the National Mall. Its building created a collective salience, adds Mintz, one that centered the Holocaust in the hearts and minds of American citizens. By the 1980s, Carter's goal became a reality. Holocaust memory became American memory. Selective, however, is how scholars tend to describe the UK's collective memory of the Holocaust. Historian Michelle Gordon suggests that this selectivity has much to do with British desires to maintain a sense of World War II benevolence. In her words, quote, misperceptions that have long reigned in British history include representing the country as an unequivocally good actor in World War II, not least fighting Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to save European Jewry, end quote. But this is contradictory to what happened next. While Britain did pursue international justice through Nazi war crime trials, it also faced significant labor shortages, leading to the development of several specialized programs aimed at recruiting European volunteer workers, the EVW. As scholars have shown, EVW migrants underwent minimal vetting regarding potential involvement in war crimes. In fact, not only was the vetting process minimal, but it was marred by racial biases, including anti-Jewish ones, as Jewish disabled persons were frequently denied resettlement. Jewish displaced persons were frequently denied resettlement opportunities in Britain. Not unlike the effects of the rat line, which funneled Nazis to countries mostly, although not exclusively, outside of Europe through fascist networking, the exploitation of connections, and bureaucratic lapses. These oversights allowed numerous Nazi collaborators from both Central and Eastern Europe to start new lives in Britain without facing investigation. In 1948, the British government even directed its Commonwealth countries to cease investigations into individuals potentially implicated in World War II atrocities. The conflicting goals of pursuing international justice through Nazi war crime trials and reconstructing post-war Britain without properly vetting its migrants highlights just some of the paradoxes in Britain's post-war objectives. Not even the global airing of the Eichmann trial changed this lackluster sentiment. While the trial contributed to a more public awareness about the Holocaust, especially through the airing of survivor stories, it did not prompt the same cultural shift as seen in the United States. Biblical scholar James Crossley also links British tensions to an even broader cultural shift, the anti-racist and multicultural consciousness of postmodernity. Emerging in the latter half of the 20th century, postmodernity describes a period characterized by the rejection of universal truth claims in favor of diversity, plurality, and the acknowledgement of multiple perspectives. Scholars observe, however, that beneath the facade of liberal inclusiveness, racism and discrimination persist. Leaning on the insights of cultural theorists, Crossley writes that liberal Western multicultural inclusiveness is typically an acceptance of the other without the otherness. Reminiscent of Jordan Peele's 2017 social horror film Get Out, Crossley highlights how philo-Semitism is often blurred with anti-Semitism. Just as the rich white characters in Get Out seek to literally inhabit Black bodies while maintaining their white minds, thus showing a simultaneous fetishization and repulsion of Blackness, many thinkers in the Western postmodern era seek to engage the Jew on non Jewish terms, which some might say sounds a bit like the new perspective on Paul. Indeed, many scholars shaped by an American post war consciousness found Dunn's and Wright's work to maintain old perspective undertones. In their view, the new perspective's remaining supersessionist claim that Paul is still reaching towards something better than what his Jewish contemporaries could understand makes the done right model, and excuse the pun, not done right. From this perspective was born what scholars now call the radical new perspective on Paul, now more frequently called the Paul within Judaism approach. This approach agrees that Paul was Jewish, but also often focuses on the fact that Paul was not speaking to fellow Jews, but rather to Gentiles. Paul, this approach tends to belabor, was saying whatever necessary, including belittling Jewish law, in order to persuade Gentiles to stay Gentile, i.e., to not follow Jewish law, as following such would make them Jewish. Perhaps even in an attempt to fulfill the common Jewish messianic hope that both Jews and Gentiles would worship the God of Israel together in the end of days. Paul, in short, was not trying to dismantle Judaism. He was simply trying to stop Gentiles from converting to Judaism. The Sonderweg variant, i.e., special path variant, of the radical new perspective / Paul within Judaism approach takes the premise that Paul was not dismantling Judaism to the highest courts. Pioneered by American Canadian Lloyd Gaston and American John Gager, and echoed in many interpretations, including ones within my own doctoral seminars, which is to say, I was academically trained in the Sonderweg model. It claims that only Gentiles need Christ in order to be saved in Paul's imagined end of days. Because Gentiles were not born into the promises of Abraham and the gift of law, they are the ones who need a separate special path, Christ. The overall point regarding Jews, then, is that they are fine. They don't need Christ. Thus, Paul, both as a Jew and in his thinking of fellow Jews, is still good. Gentiles must stay Gentile, Gentiles must believe in Christ, but Jews can stay as they are. From this angle, the Dunn Wright new perspective and the Sonderweg variant may not actually be so different. Dunn's and Wright's Paul sees that God is not ethnocentric and that God's grace is for everyone. The Sonderweg model replies in the affirmative, at least when it comes to salvation. Yes, everyone is saved, Jews by way of Abraham and Torah, Gentiles by way of Christ, and in turn Abraham, Christ grafts them in. In this model, all are ushered into the end times. There are pushbacks, of course, which is to say, not every Paul within Judaism scholar positions Paul within Judaism in the same way. New Testament scholar Matthew Thiessen, for example, positions his scholarship in the Paul within Judaism approach, but against the Sonderweg variant, and in doing so argues against traditional aspects of the universalist model by claiming that Paul was not above particularity or ethnocentrism. Paul, he says, was ethnocentric. Paul's own thinking was stressing, for instance, that the gospel was for the Jew first and then for the Greek. Even something as basic as Paul's frequent use of the term Gentile, Thiessen says, to refer to all non-Jews, demonstrates the ethnocentric nature of Paul's thought. He dissolves all non-Jewish ethnicities and cultures into one catch-all word. Thiessen thus starts with a different premise, one mirrored in work on the ethnic particularity of the Israelite God, i.e., this God is the God of ethnic Israel, by arguing that Paul is particularistic in his focus on the Israelite God via the particularly ethnic Jewish Jesus. For Thiessen, and he is not alone in this, all are saved, but all are saved in the particular ethnocentric Christ. All of this is to say, some scholars do see ethnic particularity and even ethnic action in Paul's theology of the end times. Both Jews and Gentiles need to act in certain ways, indeed in ethnocentric ways, in order to be saved. Of course, much more can be said of each of these schools, including how each of their logics can be deconstructed. The point of this talk is to simply introduce the three most common yet conflicting evaluations of Paul and how, or perhaps more rightly why, different scholars imagine Paul so differently. To summarize these schools, the old perspective claims that Paul rejected Judaism in favor of a universal non-Jewish Christianity. As such, Jews cannot be saved. The new perspective claims that Paul is against the ethnocentrism of Judaism. as such, Jews without serious reform cannot be saved. The radical new perspective, or Paul within Judaism approach, highlights that it's really Gentiles for Paul who need the most help. For Sonderweg thinkers in particular, all Jews, no matter what, will be saved. I'll close by saying that each of these perspectives has not only been shaped by scholarly social contexts, but has also had profound implications for broader Jewish-Christian relations. I recognize that for those who are hoping to correct the long history of Christian anti-Semitism, may opt for the Sonderweg variant of the Paul within Judaism perspective. Something we must wrestle with, however, is our want for Paul to promote something he may not have actually promoted. It is possible, likely, I think, that Paul was discriminatory and that he excluded certain people from his theology of salvation. It is my deep hope that we can learn to read Paul historically without enacting or perpetuating a type of exclusivist history he may have actually wanted. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much for your talk. That was incredible. And as we kind of move into the last 9, 10 minutes of this presentation, if anyone has a question, please feel free to drop it in. Else, I'm going to jump in with the first question to kind of just break the ice. So one of the things that you said early on that I found quite interesting about Paul was that he could have worked with a copyist or a scribe, and that, in working with some type of intermediary, we could have seen some shift in the writing or an impact on the writing that kind of survives to this day. And one of the reasons that you gave was perhaps through rebellion. And I was wondering, would you mind just talking a little bit more about like the potential of that? That for me, that's kind of a new theory, and I hadn't quite heard of it, or maybe I just don't recall it. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about that, that's super interesting.
Yeah, so great question. Thank you so much. And I should start by referencing a new book that has recently come out by Candida Moss called God's Ghostwriters. It's brilliant and it's very accessible. It's written to a broad audience, but has also made a huge splash in the scholarly community. And she's making the claim that perhaps many of the texts in the New Testament are written by the hands of enslaved workers. But to your question of rebellion, yeah, I mean, if an enslaved worker has access to writing and some and this is what Dr. Moss really gets at, some enslaved people were trained specifically to read and write to work for their master. So they have this ability that much of the population does not. They could then have the ability to potentially insert their own views into others' writings and perhaps even subvert other views or subvert intended views by way of changing the writing along the way.
And just as again, I know this is not necessarily your specific presentation area of research, but I'm just curious, what are the kind of the methodologies or models of making those types of arguments? Is it something, because I'm just trying to imagine if I were sitting and writing and making this argument, that could be a pretty tricky methodology. Yeah.
It is, and Dr. Moss names this actually at the front of her work. I mean, part of it is what's now what's called critical fabulation. This idea of kind of filling in the gaps. The fact of the matter remains, as I stated in this talk, we have such little information, and we know so much less about lives than we would like, and most lives are not known or erased. But for instance, when we look to some biblical writings, a question that might pop up is, why are so many men here? Well, surely men aren't the only people who existed in the world. Just because women aren't there as much as we might think doesn't mean that 50% of the population, weren't women. And so we might try to fill in some gaps of, okay, what's missing here and what might we know about humans in the ancient world? So yes, it is filling in a gap by trying to fill in, okay, well, we know that enslaved persons were trained specifically to do this kind of work.
Mhm.
Um, what might that push us to question further? If enslaved workers who are forced to do this and have terrible conditions have access to reading and writing, what might they be able to do with that tool? So it's a tricky methodology. It's sort of filling in emptiness, but oftentimes emptiness doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do something.
No, absolutely. And I think just more broadly construed, one of the arguments whenever I teach is, as a historian, part of what you do, you have to kind of use like your imagination or kind of fill in the gaps to help you create a narrative or kind of assess evidence in ways that you might not have thought about before. But really interesting. And I did this kind of brings me to my next point. One of the things that really I find super interesting about Pauline scholarship is that, you know, at the birth of Christianity and kind of its spread and its nascency, Paul is like the main guy. That's the first person you kind of look at and talk about and teach. And there's this clear kind of tussle between being Jewish and then developing early Christian identity. The idea of how do you emerge from a sect to something kind of larger. But one of the things that's I think very interesting about Paul is we are in a very kind of syncretic space, right? So as you mentioned early on, it's Greco-Roman, we see Jewish background, we see this idea of Christianity and a diversity of early Christian communities just by the basis of his letters alone. And so it's funny how it's reflected in the modern scholarship, maybe like, a millennia later. We're still tussling, moving from the old perspective to the new perspective to the radical new perspective in much the same way I think that struggle kind of unfolded there. But I did want to delve a little bit more specifically into the communities that he was writing to. Was it that Paul was very unique for being kind of this syncretic figure, right? So Jewish, but espousing this kind of Christian ideology. We've still gone back and forth with it. And the people that are receiving it, are we assuming that these individuals are kind of strictly delineated in one way? And I can't imagine that being the case. And so how do kind of scholars approach the audience question is what I would like to kind of ask.
The big one. I think it's really difficult. I think it's hard because I think often when we open up these letters, we're sort of primed to think that Paul is writing to a very specific community that really, you know, agrees with Paul at the outset. But I think just to add even more to what you started with in terms of diversity, we don't know much about these assemblies. We don't know if Paul is trying to actually use writing to fluff up these assemblies, or like on the one hand we could very easily say, okay, Paul is writing to actual assemblies who are asking him very specific questions and he's responding to them
Mhm.
at this. And that's a traditional way of thinking, that these are actual real assemblies that are writing to Paul and he's responding. And I kind of leaned into that in this talk. But we could also wonder, might Paul be kind of fabricating stuff about these communities, perhaps in a way to get other people to read and to act in a certain way. It's unclear. I guess I would say it. I really think it's difficult to answer questions of who were these audiences and
Mhm.
how much did they even like Paul? Did they respect Paul? Did they like Paul? Like, how big are these audiences? We can't really know. What I will say is I think it was remarkably diverse. I don't think Paul was necessarily the special guy doing what he was doing. I
Yeah, I
think
think
he
that
was
was
one among many, sharing his ideas as a Jew, and as a Jew who thought Jesus was the Christ. I don't think he's special in that regard. I don't know how much can be said about specifics with these communities. That with audience, that's a hard one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's just how do we kind of conceptualize the voice of this writer that we have across kind of, this tapestry of the background. So is it that Paul is clearly not the only one speaking, but is it that he's so unique in trying to espouse this specific like eschatological point of view, making him unique to the assembly that he's writing or not? And so again, it's difficult when you just have a one-way shot so that individuals who's writing the letter who kind of, it's very difficult for us to fact check, very, very difficult for us to kind of understand the community that it was actually going to. But really understanding kind of his uniqueness.
Yeah, I mean, we're also just relying on the perspective of those who created the canon by inserting Paul into it hundreds of years later. I mean, for all we know, there's all sorts of other material that could have been canonized that has been lost to us. So we're making Paul, a little bit more unique just because those who canonize the New Testament are choosing to insert Paul into it in the way that they are.
in strategic positions. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because I mean, as late ancient historians, we often, I think my gut feeling is to, okay, let's go to these original sources and look at them alone. But again, the millennia that have like kind of passed since that time have clearly had an impact on the sources that survive and the sources that I'm actually like considering as canonical themselves. So yeah, absolutely. I do think that's something that I'm sometimes guilty of. So yeah, I completely agree. But this perfectly takes us to 6 o'clock. So I just want to say thank you so much. This was really incredible, and a super amazing kind of introduction to those who might not have studied Paul before. So really, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.